The final fall sprint to Election Day. And with just 9 weeks left, a big primary win for progressives in Florida.
We don't believe we should have to shrink from the things that we believe in order to win.
Plus, the president slams the Mueller probe and issues a new threat.
Our Justice Department and our FBI have to start doing their job. At some point, I'll get in there if I have to.
And the nation bids farewell to an American icon, the bipartisan tribute to Senator John McCain.
The world is smaller for his departure, and we will remember him as he was, unwavering, undimmed, unequal.
We never doubted the other man's sincerity or the other man's patriotism, or that when all was said and done, we were on the same team.
Inside Politics, the biggest stories sourced by the best reporters now. Welcome to Inside Politics. I'm Phil Mattingly. John King is off today. To our viewers in the United States and around the world, thanks for sharing your Sunday. Two powerful absences cast a shadow over Washington today. John McCain this afternoon heads to his final resting place at hallowed Green Lawn at Annapolis. A day ago, 3 former presidents, hundreds of former colleagues and top U.S. officials, and millions more watching paused to remember an irreplaceable American. At Washington National Cathedral, the keepers of American power all sang or hummed along to America the Beautiful. A salute to McCain, who maybe more than anyone, more than self, his country loved. 2 eulogies by 2 former presidents spoke to McCain's and America's aspiration for something higher, a moral clarity carried in the naval aviator's old scars. President George W. Bush said McCain should be judged by whom he abhorred and for those whose causes he carried.
John detested the abuse of power, could not abide bigots and swaggering despots. There was something deep inside him that made him stand up for the little guy. If we're ever tempted to forget who we are, to grow weary of our cause, John's voice will always come as a whisper over our shoulder. We are better than this. America is better than this.
President Barack Obama asked the country to move past its petty divides and embrace something greater.
Our public discourse can seem small and mean and petty. Trafficking in bombast and insult. It's a politics that pretends to be brave and tough, but in fact is born of fear. John called on us to be bigger than that.
Both presidents preaching uncontroversial values, uniquely American ideals, unquestionably embodied by McCain. And yet the moment made all the more uncommon by the glaring absence of the current president. The subtext of the service, it is the talk of Washington. But the gut-punch grief felt by Meghan McCain is common to every American family.
When my father got sick, and I asked him what he wanted me to do with this eulogy, he said, "Show them how tough you are." That is what love meant to John McCain. My father is gone, and my sorrow is immense. But I know his life, and I know it was great because it was good.
With us this Sunday to share their reporting and their insights, Julie Pace with the Associated Press, CNN's Jeff Zeleny, Jonathan Martin with the New York Times, and the Washington Post's Sung-Min Kim. Now, guys, I've been kind of in an internal debate, and I think we also at CNN have been in an internal debate in terms of what this week has actually meant, right? These are statements, these are ideas that aren't necessarily rare to what America is. But I want to read what Senator McCain in his final letter said, or it was spoken by Rick Davis, his campaign manager, former campaign manager. "We are citizens of the world's greatest republic, a nation of ideals, not blood and soil. We weaken our greatness when we confuse our patriotism with tribal rivalries that have sown resentment and hatred and violence in all corners of the world. We weaken it when we hide behind walls rather than tear them down." Big question, what was this week actually about?
Well, I think what was so striking about this week is, to your point, so many of the things that were said by John McCain in his final letter, by the former presidents at the service yesterday, were just very standard American values. We weren't talking about something that was unique for American leaders to be discussing. But in this moment, it was seen as a rebuke to the current president. That's extraordinary that things that are so bedrock to this country are seen as out of sync with the current president. And it's because he has taken such a different approach. He does not cast America as this great nation. He casts America as a nation that's cheated by Canada, that's been cheated by Asian countries and Mexico, that has to wall itself off from other nations. He's been very successful politically in doing that, but it is really counter to what we are used to hearing from our leaders, and this was a reminder of those more traditional values this week.
And when Senator McCain asked the people to speak at his eulogy, he planned every minute of this, and he set the tone for that in his own message, in Meghan McCain's message. And I am told that the presidents and others speaking were also told not to hold back. This was the theme. This was what he wanted them to share. And you're right, it was a message that heard in a different time. It would have been potentially the same words, but it is different in this moment. And the fact that the president was not there, the fact that a couple of his top advisors, actually several of his top advisors were there, certainly was interesting. But I think after we move beyond this week, you have to wonder if anything changes at all. The possibility, I think, there will be one senator who wants to be the next John McCain. That is a great position to be in because you can have policy positions, you know, a lot of press coverage, frankly. So I think let's cut the chase, Jeff. No question. So I think that is something that may change. You saw a lot of hungry senators in there wanting to fill that void. But in terms of changing our politics, don't count on it.
Yeah, I want to get to that last point in a second. But first I want to play some sound from Meghan McCain, a very poignant speech, but also one that was not even remotely subtle. Take a listen.
We gather here to mourn the passing of American greatness. The real thing, not cheap rhetoric from men who will never come near the sacrifice he gave so willingly, nor the opportunistic appropriation of those who live lives of comfort and privilege while he suffered and served. America does not boast because she has no need to. The America of John McCain has no need to be made great again because America was always great.
And it was the applause as much as the words that I think I was taken aback by there.
You just don't hear applause at most funerals mid-speech, period. And you certainly don't hear applause mid-speech at a funeral in the National Cathedral, which, I mean, is a place that is majestic, but also it's sort of very old church and very proper and upright. And that was something else to hear that. I think, to be totally blunt, I think our politics marches ahead. Jeff is right. I think there will be opportunities for folks to step up and try to fill that McCain role. I think those opportunities will be whetted, by the way, by the election in 2 months. I mean, that to me is the pivot point here, is what happens on Election Day, and is there a rebuke of the Republican Party and of Trumpism? And if there is, then I think you'll see more folks do what Jeff's talking about and realize that there's an opportunity here to sort of set ourselves apart, and perhaps not just an opportunity, but an imperative too. Depending upon how bad the Election Day actually is.
Yeah, so, man, you and I trips through the halls of Congress and stand on marble floors unendingly. We put together something, you know, senators that either publicly or even maybe privately talk about kind of a younger group of senators, both parties, that the institution is broken, that they want to fix it. Haven't quite figured out how yet. I want to pull some of those up and you take a look at Michael Bennet or Chris Coons, Joni Ernst, Doug Jones, James Lankford to some degree, Tim Scott, Todd Young on some issues. What's your sense of kind of this next generation, if there's any chance they'll be successful?
I think there's clearly a hunger for more bipartisanship in the mold of John McCain, but yet those efforts haven't come to fruition just yet. I mean, we've seen so many instances this year where this gang of 40 or the gang of 25 have gathered in
Talking Sticks.
Yes, Talking Sticks. It gathered in Susan Collins' office, who's been regarded, or that office has kind of been regarded as the Switzerland of the Senate. Right. But yet, what have they done to result from it? And I think that's just the polarization of our politics has really seeped down into the Senate, and there will be no figure like John McCain for some time. I thought it was quite appropriate when Mitch McConnell said he would put together a gang to figure out how to properly remember the senator, because John McCain was involved in basically any gang in the Senate, whether it was trying to pass immigration reform in 2013 or, you know, trying to stave off a filibuster attempt back in 2017 when it ultimately sadly failed. But I think that there will be a struggle to kind of replace that bipartisanship gravitas that the senator brought, and I think we've certainly, felt that presence missing from the Senate halls in the last, 8-9 months.
And let's see, by the way, real fast, speaking of primaries, Tom Carper, the longtime senator from Delaware, has a primary this week. He's somebody who's, I think, always tried to be more of a, a moderate Democrat. Let's see how close his opponent gets, because that's the kind of chilling impact that certainly we've seen the last 8 years in the GOP. If that kind of thing starts happening with Democrats now, I think that's going to make it harder for Democrats like Chris Coons, who is his colleague in Delaware, to be bipartisan, to sort of defy their own party.
Yeah, it's not a straight line. There's so many different dynamics at play into whether or not this will actually occur. I will miss being called a little jerk.
And a little brat.
And a little brat. All right, as we go to break, one more image that I really want to show you. You're looking right now at 87-year-old Congressman Sam Johnson. Now, the Texas Republican was a fellow prisoner of war and one of McCain's cellmates in Vietnam. Now, Johnson is usually confined to a scooter or a wheelchair, but in one of the week's many signs of bipartisanship, Democrats Nancy Pelosi and Joe Crowley here helping him to the casket to say farewell to Senator McCain. We'll be right back.
Sometimes the...
Stop me if you've heard this one before. With his administration facing growing legal pressure, President Trump is lashing out at the Mueller probe and the Justice Department.
Our Justice Department and our FBI have to start doing their job and doing it right and doing it now. Because people are angry. People are angry. I wanted to stay out, but at some point, if it doesn't straighten out properly, I want them to do their job. I will get involved, and I'll get in there if I have to.
Now, the president says people are angry, but a new ABC News Washington Post poll suggests otherwise. Take a look at this. 63% of Americans approve of Special Counsel Mueller's handling of the investigation, a near mirror image of President Trump's 60% disapproval rate. Just 36% of Americans approve of his performance as president. Now, these numbers suggest somewhat of a shift. There once was an agreed-upon narrative that the president's attacks on the investigation were having an effect. Perhaps that's not so settled anymore. And even more significantly, there is zero indication that any of those attacks have actually deterred Robert Mueller from opening new avenues of his investigation. Just on Friday, a Washington lobbyist pleaded guilty to funneling foreign money into President Trump's inauguration and agreed to cooperate with investigators moving forward. And in a new court filing, former Trump campaign aide George Papadopoulos publicly contradicted testimony by Attorney General Jeff Sessions. Now, Papadopoulos says that at a March 2016 meeting, you can see that pictured here from a Trump campaign Instagram post, both Sessions and then-candidate Trump signaled support for a proposed meeting between Trump and Vladimir Putin during the campaign. It says, while some in the room rebuffed George's offer, Mr. Trump nodded with approval and deferred to Mr. Sessions, who appeared to like the idea and stated that the campaign should look into it. George's giddiness over Mr. Trump's recognition was prominent during the days that followed. All right, we'll get to George Papadopoulos in a second. There's a lot to go into there. I don't know if we have enough time. But first, I kind of want to go 30,000-foot level, and that is what we're seeing from the president right now on Twitter, including yesterday, throughout the course of the week. Is this a reflection to what he's reading in the news, or is this just the lingering frustration of what this investigation means for his administration?
I mean, that's a great question. We don't know exactly what he's reacting to. Usually it's something he sees on Fox. But I think if we take stock of where we are right now, at the beginning of September, summer is over. This investigation is still very much on. That likely means, almost certainly means, that the investigation is going to continue through the midterm elections. So it's going to be something that the president is going to use or try and use. He likes to find an opponent. But the reality here is we still don't know what Bob Mueller has found, what his team has found. They're probably going to put this on hold, releasing any findings until after the midterms. Rudy Giuliani was out this week saying we're going to release our own report. Half or probably a third of the country's interested or will believe what they have to say. But the reality is the real report from Bob Mueller will come after the midterms, and What party controls Congress at that point? That is the central question to all of this. So after the summer, I'd kind of thought more of this would have been resolved by now. It's not. It means Bob Mueller is still going after something. The plea deal on Friday, I think, is more significant than we think. We've never heard of this guy, but the reality is, if they were looking into money from that point, what else are they looking into from that same period?
And on that front, real quick, because Rudy Giuliani actually talked about this, but to your point, this is the first time the Justice Department has publicly charged a person for helping a foreigner secretly funnel money into the Trump inauguration, which has been something that a lot of people have been looking into. Right. Rudy Giuliani was asked about that. Take a listen to what he had to say.
It turned out to be this irrelevant indictment where I think Mueller has turned into the private prosecutor. I mean, what does this have to do with President Trump? Not a single thing. Has nothing to do with collusion. Some guy who donated to the inauguration. My goodness, there are about 500,000 people that donated to President Trump. Every time they get a speeding ticket, the special prosecutor is going to do it.
I think Rudy Giuliani answered his own point there, which is, what does this have to do with President Trump? It was the Trump inauguration. So there's the link right there. Look, Bob Mueller, yes, is going after things that when you're talking about such high-level questions like obstruction and collusion with Russians can look small. But actually, I think it's just being methodical. You know, he is deep in a complicated investigation, and he is pulling out bit players. He is charging them when they lie to him. He is charging them for things like FARA violations that often don't get prosecuted. But all indications are that he is moving towards something bigger. That doesn't necessarily mean an indictment of the president or someone in his inner circle, but as he tries to answer those larger questions about obstruction or collusion, he's basically letting nothing slide. And I think part of that is trying to send a message to people who come in to sit before the grand jury, to come interview with his prosecutors, that if you don't come in, you don't tell us the truth, or you have something in your background, we are going to go after you. That's the type of aggressive investigation that this is, regardless of what Rudy Giuliani and others say.
Yeah.
And he's also trying to get folks to talk, and he's using the various levers that are at his disposal to make folks talk, including offering them some measure of plea deals. In some cases, that's worked. In others, it has not worked, at least not yet. With Paul Manafort, of course, the president said that he didn't break. Just extraordinary in its own right. And I think we'll see if that continues, given the fact that Manafort's got a second trial coming up here. But no, I totally agree with Julie. I think that we're very much in the dark as to what he actually is doing and what he actually has. Most of the information that we know has come from the Trump side of this, not the Mueller side of this.
Yeah, so I mean, I want to ask you something. First, I want to read something from the president sat down with Bloomberg News and gave an interview, and he was asked about complying with the subpoena if he chooses not to testify. That's clearly a legal fight that I think everybody thinks is coming. And he said, Trump said in the interview, "I'll see what happens when it comes to a subpoena. I view it differently. I view it as an illegal investigation because, quote, great scholars have said that there never should have been a special counsel," the president told Bloomberg. So you have great scholars, which the president is not specifying who that is. Let's also pull up, I don't know, federal judges and their views of whether or not the investigation is legal. So if you take a look at these 4 federal judges from presidents from both parties, all of whom have ruled that the special counsel is, in fact, legal. So despite what maybe is being heard on cable news. But I want to ask you to the broader point here. Is this the fight that's coming right now, the fight over a subpoena, quashing a subpoena, something like that?
Well, I think his lawyers have already made it clear weeks ago that if there is a subpoena issued by Mueller, that this is a fight that will go all the way to the Supreme Court. And I think that's why we've seen these interview negotiations between Mueller's team and Trump team kind of ebb and flow and kind of almost essentially stop at this point. And the subpoena issue is so important, too, in the fact that it may go all the way to the Supreme Court because, again, we'll talk about this later, but we do have a Supreme Court confirmation fight going on. And one of the big contentious points about Brett Kavanaugh's record is his views on executive power. He gives a lot of latitude to the executive branch in this. He discusses his views in detail in legal articles and in public forums. But that is definitely a point that Democrats will be bringing up when there is potentially a live fight that he will face as soon as he's sworn into the Supreme Court. How will you handle that issue? Now, Kavanaugh's not going to answer that, but is definitely an issue that is looming over this confirmation and the subpoena fight.
It's a good tease to a couple of minutes from now. One more before I let you go, and that's the George Papa Papadopoulos filing. There's been a lot of questions about whether Jeff Sessions was honest in his testimony during his confirmation hearings. What do we think is the significance of that Friday evening holiday weekend filing?
Well, George Papadopoulos has been one of these kind of strange characters in all of this because he was not a major player in the Trump campaign, but he actually was on this foreign policy advisory team that was announced by Trump. He was in meetings with the president. I would think that there are kind of two significant things here. One, it does contradict Jeff Sessions' testimony. And there's been a lot of questions about what Sessions has said, in part because there have been holes picked in other things that he said. So I do think that he probably is going to have to answer for this. And the second piece of this, though, is President Trump is already furious at Jeff Sessions. Right. And I think anything that fuels that is noteworthy. I'm surprised we actually haven't seen any tweets from the president about that so far.
It's one more reason to say that, but the president also said in the Bloomberg interview that Jeff Sessions was safe until November. After that, he wouldn't say.
Yeah.
I think it's widely understood that Sessions is on the way out after the midterms.
I think everybody would acknowledge that. If not publicly, then certainly privately. All right, coming up, bad news for the GOP. We're unveiling new CNN House race ratings with some unwelcome numbers for the president and his party. Blitz is on 9 weeks until the November midterms, and this morning, new signs of a potential looming Republican reckoning. CNN is moving 11 congressional seats away from Republicans and toward Democrats, and 3 seats are moving towards the GOP. Now, of the 30 seats CNN considers toss-ups, 28 are held by Republicans, and 12 of those Republicans are running in districts Hillary Clinton won in 2016. So at least in the House, for the most endangered GOP candidates, the president's presence probably hurts more than it helps. Now, his post-Labor Day travel schedule mostly keeps the president out of purple territory by design in Republican strongholds like Texas or in red states where blue state Senate Democrats are on the ballot. Now, the president, he's keenly aware an Election Day wave would imperil not just his agenda, but also potentially put things like impeachment on the table. His message to voters this week, I'm not on the ballot, but 2018 is about my presidency.
You aren't just voting for a candidate, you're voting for which party controls Congress. Somebody has a cold, we no longer have the majority. We need Republicans in Congress.
Look, first off, he's not wrong.
He's right about
that. He's absolutely right about his agenda. He's absolutely right about his poll here. But I want to pull up, we've noted already the ABC News Washington Post poll, where you talk about where the president's approval is. Take a look at his approval among GOP voters. This has been the stalwart kind of linchpin to everything they've been doing. And over the course of the last month and a half, 2 months, it, at least according to this poll, is down 9 points. Now, it's one poll. It's not indicative of everything, but is that is there a bigger problem here?
Oh, yeah. Look, I mean, if he's below 80% with this party, that's a huge issue. Yeah. I had a really smart Republican operative tell me the challenge that we have, the party has, is that every time it's one of these episodes, whether it's Helsinki, whether it's the reminder of Stormy Daniels, where that cohort of sort of swing Republicans, folks who kind of like the policies but cringe at some of the behavior, every time their noses are rubbed in the face of what they don't like about this president, they see a 10 to 15% drop in his own views, the views of the president. And what that does, Phil, is that directly impacts the House candidates who are on the ballot, because so much of these House races is about the views of the president and the views of the two parties. And any time those sort of soft Republicans, as they're called in the jargon of politics, are reminded about what they don't like about this president, it sort of turns them off. It sort of makes them walk away from the party. And that's a lot of crucial votes, too.
Well, and when you combine the drop in Republicans with those numbers on independents, I mean, those are terrible numbers with independents. Yes. And if you look at some of these swing districts where Republicans are going to need to hold their seats in places like Virginia and Pennsylvania, there's a really competitive race in Minnesota that hasn't been competitive in a long time in that district. If you don't have those independents, you're already in a really difficult position. If you are dropping to about 80% with Republicans, it's almost impossible.
They're almost on the verge of now acknowledging at the White House that the House is going to be impossible to hold. So much more discussion is on the Senate. I'm hearing from more people saying, well, what if Democrats control the House? What if impeachment happens? Maybe that is better for the president in 2020. So that conversation is very much alive and well. And they may be right about that. I mean, it happened in the Clinton impeachment. Of course, the situation is totally different. It's a different era, different time. But the idea of holding the House seems to be escaping that. And we saw where the president is traveling. Yes, he's going to red states. But even inside red states, they have to pick very specifically where he can go because he fires up the base for these House districts in other big cities. So it's a complicated minefield out there for the president. But the idea of the House, it's tough.
So you make an interesting point. The president announcing this week on Twitter that he's going to Texas for Ted Cruz, looking for the biggest stadium he can find, Kyle Field. That's my vote. That would be awesome. Hit
105,000.
105,000. Let's do it. Let's do it. But there's an interesting
area market, though, Phil. That's the challenge.
So this is the point, right? You have
Houston.
You have Republicans in those markets who are endangered right now and probably haven't run a tough race for most of their careers, who are saying, don't do this, please, don't do this. I mean, is that right, or is it?
Yeah, and it's just the constant struggles that you're seeing and the different dynamics between the House and the Senate races that we're seeing, because we talk about how bleak the picture looks for House Republicans. Senate Republicans are in a better position right now. And I think, to Jeff's point, when I was traveling with the president to Columbus, Ohio a few weeks ago, or maybe it was last week.
Best city and best state in the union.
According to you, the best city in the city in the country. He took a little bit of a different tone, and he was bullish on the Senate, which I think is a fair assessment. But he did acknowledge that the House is probably tougher, and I think that was such an interesting point, that it was such a contrast to his constant red wave rhetoric that we hear from him, and the fact, and you do see that little bit of political reality seeping in. But in the Senate, Republicans still feel very good. They especially feel good about North Dakota, Florida, Indiana, and Missouri. Those are the states that the Democrats are the most concerned about. And as we know with the Senate, it can accomplish more of Trump's agenda just because of their role in the confirmation process.
Just real fast, these cycles tend to go together, House and Senate, right? But here we are at Labor Day, and it does seem like, at least right now, it's possible that the House and Senate fortunes could diverge. And if you look at that map you guys showed there on the screen, what's so striking to me about that is that the two coasts in this country, not a single state was filled in as somewhere where the president is going to campaign. And why is that? Because a lot of the action on the two coasts is House races, whereas the Senate races are, by and large, in the interior of the country.
So this is an interesting point. It's that they're two separate maps, right? And basically the operatives are looking at it as two separate different types of races.
That changes.
And then in the middle you have Florida. Where it's like the exact, and I'm talking about the governor's race specifically. J. Mart, you wrote about this, about where traditionally in a governor's race you have people kind of tack back towards the center after the primaries. You have, on one case, Ron DeSantis. Take a look at this ad from the primary, which is pretty clear about what it means.
Ron loves playing with the kids.
Build the wall.
He reads stories.
Then Mr. Trump said, "You're fired." I love that part.
He's teaching Madison to talk.
Make America great again.
People say Ron's all Trump, but he is so much more.
Big league. So good.
I mean, the Panhandle is thrilled. Now, that was a little bit tongue-in-cheek, his team said.
Not poking fun at themselves, but that's Florida, not Wyoming or Oklahoma, right? This is the swingiest of swing states where, every election is basically decided by a point or less, or at least lots of them are. And I think it's a real risk to sort of do that in the primary. Look, I would expect him to try to tack back towards a more Florida-centric, center-right positioning in the general election. I think we're going to hear a lot more about Navy JAG officer Ron DeSantis than we are MAGA Ron DeSantis here for the next 2 months.
But following up on that, Andrew Gillum isn't exactly tacking towards the center either. No. He's a progressive candidate.
But because that's where that's where Democratic energy is, and I do think that he recognizes that for him to win in a state like Florida, he's going to have to ramp up that turnout. But I think, to J. Mart's point, like messaging-wise, I think you are going to see a bit of an evolution.
It's going to be more about algae than Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump. Algae, by the way, for the folks there at home in Florida know this, is a huge issue in Florida right now.
Huge issue.
No, and Phil, yes, algae.
Give me the algae. I want all the red algae. No, it's actually really important.
It's a huge story in Florida right now.
Serious, important.
The question is, where does the president go in Florida? I mean, he'll go to Florida, but where does he go? Does he go to Orlando, other places, or just Pensacola?
Panama City, baby.
All right, you're in on that one.
See you there.
All right.
More Bama.
One more important thing to note after Tuesday's primary, another sign that this really is the year of the woman. 6 Senate races will be all-female contests in Nebraska, New York, Washington State, Wisconsin, Minnesota, and Arizona, and there could be one more depending on the results of this week's Massachusetts primary. That's a record, beating the previous high of 3 back in 2012.
You're an original, and your eye...
This weekend marks the end of Washington's long, hot, and very eventful summer. Now, you can look and see some of the big stories. All of this has happened since July 9th. Now, why does that matter? That's the day President Trump nominated Brett Kavanaugh to the Supreme Court. It looks small in print because there's so many of them. All the other news has largely overshadowed Brett Kavanaugh. But if he's confirmed, he might actually be President Trump's longest-lasting legacy. Kavanaugh could cement conservative dominance on the high court well into, say, the 2040s. His confirmation hearing starts Tuesday, and you can expect to hear lots of questions about abortion and whether he'd vote to overturn Roe versus Wade, questions he probably won't answer. But Kavanaugh could be the swing vote on a more immediate issue. Does Robert Mueller have the power to subpoena President Trump and the Russia probe? Democrats say they're concerned.
One of the things that's unique about his views is his position on presidential supremacy. And he is way up there. He believes that a president cannot even be investigated, if you will, let alone convicted while he's in office.
SMK, I just want to turn this over to you. You've been covering every in and out of this. I think we know the top line issues here, but I want to pull up the recent CNN poll that has Kavanaugh's whether he should be confirmed. It's at 37%, one of the lowest of all time, and yet it doesn't feel like there's much chance he won't be confirmed. What's your sense of Democrat strategy here?
I think what we're expecting now, unless there is a major error at his confirmation hearing, and we don't anticipate that happening, he's been preparing assiduously for the confirmation hearings next week. He's on a pretty glide track to be confirmed here. I mean, Susan Collins and Lisa Murkowski, who are the two swing Republican votes that we've been watching for some time, they haven't publicly indicated that they are actually waffling here, that they are struggling to get to a yes on this vote. And we have at least 3 red state Democrats who have made it very clear that they are open to supporting him. Heidi Heitkamp, Joe Donnelly, and Joe Manchin, who were the 3 that supported Neil Gorsuch last year. So I think while we'll be watching and dissecting every minute of the confirmation hearings this coming week, ultimately, again, unless there's a major error right in front of the bright lights of the cameras, it's not going to matter as much. And I think the Democrats will be examining, was our strategy effective to make it kind of processy and focus on documents, or should we have focused on the larger issues at stake, such as abortion rights and voting rights, civil rights? And that's something that you'll see Democrats probably examine for some time.
One thing, I want to play sound from Dan Pfeiffer. He's a pod emeritus, if you will. We dealt with him a lot at the White House, former senior advisor to President Obama, about those red state Democrats and their votes. Take a listen.
It's infuriating that at least some Democrats are at least still abiding by this old politics idea that was probably never even true, but that somehow voting for some small handful of the president's nominees for anything will help you win election. The danger of voting for the Kavanaugh nomination is you're going to get no points from the right, and you're going to deflate the enthusiasm of your base.
Yes, Jeff Zeleny?
That's Barack Obama's former aide, Dan Pfeiffer. Does not